I'm Dr. Jeff Barrows, Senior Vice President of Bioethics and Public Policy here at the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. And this is the second module in this curriculum that I have created to help you navigate the controversial issues that are hitting not only our culture, but especially us in healthcare. Now, in the first module, if you remember, I talked about the rider and the elephant. And the essence of that module was to understand the elephant. In today's module, I want to talk about how to overcome the elephant. Now, if you remember, this is an illustration that was put together by Dr. Jonathan Haidt. And this is the way he looks at the process of us making moral decisions. The rider is our rational thinking, and the elephant is our intuition. And the intuition is our experience. It's made up of our past, whether it's traumatic experiences, something that's happened to us, or something we've witnessed. But the end result is that Jonathan Haidt discovered that the vast majority of cases, elephants rule. In other words, when we're making a moral decision or coming to a moral conclusion in a particular situation, in general, we default to our intuition, to our experience, to what has happened to us in our life, rather than to our rational thinking. So I want to spend some time to really address what can we do to engage our rational thinking. Or to put it differently, how can we teach ourselves to think deeply about a particular topic, especially as it applies to making a moral decision? Now, in the first module, I talked about this illustration of our thinking process. It's two stories above the ground level, and then one story that is beneath the ground in the substructure. And just as a quick review, the second story is where we spend the vast majority of our thinking time. It's where we engage in normal conversations. It's where we make a lot of our day-to-day decisions, our day-to-day activities. Occasionally we'll do some deep thinking. Whereas the first story is where we have our principles. And our principles are made up of a combination of our experience as well as our beliefs. But I want to focus also on the substructure, where our core beliefs are, our presuppositions, and our worldview. To think deeply about a topic means to evaluate the principles and the presuppositions that you're using to come to a final decision regarding that particular moral topic. So if we're going to really learn to think deeply about a moral issue, we have to learn to interrogate the reasons why we have come to the moral decision that we have. In other words, are we basing that moral decision on our intuition, on our experience, or are we taking it down a step further and looking at our core beliefs, our core presuppositions, our worldview? For instance, in response to the question about the morality of abortion, are we just responding because we think that autonomy is important, or have we looked more deeply as to what the Bible might say about that particular issue, about abortion? For instance, we can go to Psalm 139, verses 15 and 16, where David writes that God knew him even before he was formed in his mother's womb. In other words, God knew him, God had plans for him, not at a particular stage of pregnancy. The pregnancy didn't have to get to a point where suddenly God now recognizes David, but even before David was formed in his mother's womb, God knew him, God had plans for him, and God valued him. That's a critical piece of information that we need to be interrogating as we come to the conclusion about abortion. So I want to really delve deeper into what it is that makes up our worldview. And more than likely, you are still in the process of forming your core beliefs, your presuppositions, and therefore your worldview. It's also possible to have two conflicting ideas at the same time. And let me give you a personal example. I have a vivid memory of early in my time in practice, walking into the doctor's lounge and hearing two other physicians talk about evolution. And I remember immediately affirming what they were saying about evolution. And as I turned around to leave the doctor's lounge, I stopped myself and I thought, wait a minute, I don't believe in evolution. And as I thought about it more, I realized that when I was thinking in the realm of medical science, I had accepted the idea of evolution. I had been so ingrained through my medical training that I had accepted it. But when I was in church on Sunday or attending Sunday school, I, of course, believed in creation. There was no question that we did not evolve. And so at that point in time, I was actually holding two opposing views at the same point. And I will tell you that fortunately, when I left that doctor's lounge, I had left evolution behind. I clearly made a decision, a conscious decision. No, I believe I am created. So I tell you that story just to recognize that it's possible that as you work through some of these decisions in terms of your core beliefs, your presuppositions, that you may be holding two opposing views at the same time. Now, as we look at worldview, there are two foundational worldviews that all other worldviews can be boiled down to. One is that we are created. In other words, there is a supernatural being that has brought us into being and along with the universe. The other worldview is that we are here solely as a result of a series of accidents. In other words, an evolutionary view. Now, lots of different religions will have different approaches to this, but they'll all have very similar approaches in terms of what it looks like to have that created worldview. In other words, when you have a created worldview, you recognize that the universe, the world, has a preset structure that is established by that creator. Second, there are going to be preset values within that creation. Now, those values may differ depending on the religion. The values that are put forward in the Muslim faith are very different than the values that we hold in the Christian faith. But those in both faiths will agree that there are certain values that we need to follow. And all religions teach that if you go against these preset values, you will bring harm to yourself. Now, again, the way that happens and the harm that results will differ among different religions, but they all agree that there is a harm. And so, those that adopt a created worldview recognize that the goal of a human being, if they want to flourish in this life, is to conform themselves to that preset structure, to those preset values. And when they do, they will achieve, as we call it in Christianity, the abundant life. So that's the created worldview, which is very different than the accidental worldview. In the accidental worldview, of course, the universe and all of us came into being purely by chance. There is no supernatural being. There is no preset structure. And therefore, there is no preset inherent values in the world. Now, we can set up our own values in a particular culture or society, but there are no foundational values out there. The world consists solely of raw material. We are made up of atoms, molecules that are strung together by chance, and these have come together to form life. The goal of human beings in the accidental worldview is very different then. The goal is to achieve as much power, as much strength, as much money, to use that raw material to live the life you want to live. Very different than the created worldview. So we can kind of summarize this by saying that the created worldview is abiding by God's will, whatever God wills, whereas the accidental worldview is whatever I want, whatever I will. Now, the reality is that the vast majority of us live somewhere between these two different worldviews. Even if we claim that we are Christians, we still often try and hold on to certain parts of our life and do things the way I want to do it. Or we partition off and we say, I'll give this to God, but I want to maintain control over that area. Well, that's a different matter for a different time. The bottom line is that it's your decision, first of all, as to what worldview you want to align yourself with, and secondly, how much you want to engage and become aligned with that particular worldview. I want to remind you of what it says in James, because we can be doubting in the middle, and James says, but let him ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. So if you're still vacillating between these two, you'll find that there's a lot of instability in your life and instability in your beliefs. And I would encourage you to try and get aligned with one worldview or the other as soon as you can. Now, I'm going to give you some discussion questions that I want you to spend some time talking about and stop the video. The first discussion question is, what are some examples of built-in values in medicine and dentistry today? Secondly, what would medicine and dentistry look like without those built-in values? And thirdly, what would practicing medicine or dentistry look like vacillating between two different worldviews as opposed to adopting completely the created worldview? Now, I've mentioned several times that I can't tell you what you need to believe. I can't even tell you what presuppositions you should adopt. But what I can do is to begin to challenge your thinking so that I can push you into that lower level of thinking, and so that you will adopt whatever beliefs you want to adopt and your presuppositions. So let's look at several questions in greater depth. First is, do you really believe in God? I'm not just talking about an intellectual belief, but do you really understand that you are a created being, created by God, and therefore you are aligning yourself with the left side, the created side of that worldview? Second, do you believe that Jesus is God? And this further narrows from just a general theology to Christianity. And again, it's not just an intellectual belief, but have you placed your faith in Jesus Christ because you believe that Jesus Christ is God? Thirdly, and this is critical, what is your view on the authority of the Bible? Does it have authority over your life? Do you submit to that authority? Do you believe it was written without error? Do you believe that it contains solely the Word of God? How you approach the Bible and your presuppositions to the Bible are critical in forming your worldview and critical in how you proceed moving forward in making moral decisions. And finally, are you willing to submit yourself to God? In other words, are you willing to live and make it your goal in life to conform yourself to the preset values that God has placed in this world, and have those values be what is contained in the Bible, both the Old and New Testament? In other words, Jesus used to just say to his followers, "Follow me." That in essence, he is asking that you will conform yourself, no matter what your experience, no matter what your emotions, to obeying Jesus Christ. And when you come to those decisions, that will have a profound impact on your life moving forward. Now, you might ask, why should I spend all this time thinking through what my core beliefs are and my presuppositions and my worldview? That is a valid question. But the way I would answer it is to say that there are many other questions that you're going to be asked, especially as you progress through your healthcare training. And you're going to be asked not only by your patients, but by your colleagues, family members, friends, neighbors, those you go to church with, because they're going to look to you as the expert on these things. And so it's going to be important for you to have thought about them ahead of time. So here are some questions that you need to work through as you have time, but more importantly, these are the questions that getting a solid worldview, a solid set of core beliefs and presuppositions will help you answer these questions. First, is abortion acceptable in the case of rape or incest? The only way you can work through that answer is first establishing your core beliefs, your presuppositions, and your worldview. What about gestational surrogacy? Is it ethical? Here's a difficult one. Should a Christian couple undertake in vitro fertilization? And let me give you another story about myself. I practiced obstetrics and gynecology for a number of years. And I was in practice for a number of years before a couple came to me, a Christian couple. I had been helping her with her problem with infertility, and both of them came in one day and they sat down and they asked me, Dr. Barrows, as a Christian physician, what do you think about in vitro fertilization? And I am ashamed to say that I had not thought deeply about this. This is probably 10, 15 years into my practice. I failed that Christian couple that day. I gave them an answer, but it really wasn't a good answer, and it was my fault. It was because I had not thought deeply about the issue of in vitro fertilization. So I encourage you to get prepared for those questions ahead of time. Another question is, what is your obligation to refer a patient to someone else if you are refusing to engage in a particular prescription or to do a procedure? And that may be helping with assisted suicide, helping with gender transition, it might be helping with an abortion. What is your obligation in terms of referral? Are you complicit if you refer them automatically to somebody that you know will do that procedure? These are things you need to decide ahead of time so that when you're faced this in practice, you know what to do. What is our responsibility in terms of the use of preferred personal pronouns? You will begin engaging with that as soon as you get into clinics, because we're hearing about that all across the country. Rather than waiting until it happens, what are your thoughts ahead of time? What is the best way to think about the use of personal pronouns in that setting from a biblical basis? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in other modules. Should you participate in helping someone in gender transition? And if not, what is the best way to answer them and tell them that you don't want to do that? These are things, again, we'll talk about a little bit more in the future. So the answer to the reason that you need to spend time developing your core beliefs, your presuppositions, and your worldview is that this will form the foundation for your ability to deal with some of these controversial issues as you get started into practice. So let's finish out this particular module with some additional discussion questions. First of all, why would individuals be drawn to a non-created worldview? What are the advantages of that worldview? Second, what are the negatives of that non-created worldview? There are definitely positives and there are definitely negatives. What are some of those? Why does going against the preset structure of creation bring harm to individuals if you adopt a created worldview? Why is that the case? Fourthly, how does this concept of preset values relate to our promotion of biblical values, especially when it comes to things like sexuality and creation? And lastly, in what tangible ways have you made it your goal to conform to these preset values, and how has it impacted your life?